Who let this rodent in? Get out of here right now, and I am expecting an honored guest.
Miss Victoria, I am the one trying to invest in your company.
You? I find that hard to believe.
I am Victoria Hastings. I don't shake hands with your kind.
The Hastings Plaza atrium is a cathedral of glass and ego. Victoria Hastings stands at its center, a vision in a crimson power suit, surrounded by a phalanx of board members who nod in synchronized rhythm to her every word. A man in a crisp, plain white t-shirt and tan khakis, Marcus, moves through the crowd. He isn't rushing. He carries the quiet gravity of someone who owns the air he breathes. He stops 5 feet from Victoria. Ms. Hastings? Marcus Wellington. I believe we're scheduled to discuss the lifeline for Hastings Global. He extends a hand. Victoria doesn't look at his face. She looks at his shirt. She looks at his hand, as if it's a summons she refuses to sign. She pointedly crosses her arms, tucking her hands away. I don't shake hands with your kind, she says, the words cutting through the lobby's hum like a blade. The board members go silent. This is a hub for global architects, not a resting place for vagrants or delivery boys. Security. Marcus doesn't flinch. He lowers his hand with a slow, deliberate grace. The clothes don't make the man, Victoria, but they certainly seem to unmake the woman. Get him out before he soils the carpet, she barks, turning her back on him. 2 guards converge. Smartphones are raised like weapons, as bystanders catch the sneer on her face. Marcus walks out with his head held high, leaving a vacuum of silence behind him. Victoria brushes an imaginary speck of dust from her lapel, unaware that she just incinerated the only bridge left standing. 60 minutes later, the air in the 50th floor boardroom is suffocating. Victoria stares at the digital ledger projected on the wall. The numbers are hemorrhaging red. Hastings Global, once a $2 billion titan, is now a hollow shell. They are burning through capital at a rate of $12 million a week. In the drawer of her mahogany desk lies a hostile takeover bid from a rival firm, a firm that plans to fire all 5,000 employees and sell the patents for scrap. She has exactly 14 days before the bank seizes the building. Victoria's reflection in the window shows a woman who has never known the word no. She is the daughter of a legacy, a product of elite boarding schools, and a silver spoon pedigree that taught her value is found in a tailor's stitch, not a man's character. She has spent the last 6 months being rejected by every VC firm from London to Tokyo. Difficult to work with, the reports said. Blinded by heritage, others whispered. She had pinned everything on one man, Marcus Wellington. The angel of the abyss, the man who never wears a suit, because he doesn't have to prove his worth to anyone. Her phone buzzes. It's a text from her lead assistant, Jenny, sent 3 minutes ago. Where are you? Marcus Wellington's car just left the plaza. He said the deal is dead. He said he doesn't shake hands with ghosts. The blood drains from Victoria's face. The man in the white t-shirt. Across the country, in a quiet office in Chicago, Marcus Wellington sits at a desk made of reclaimed wood. He deletes a $1.2 billion wire transfer draft with a single click. The silence in the executive suite was heavier than the gold leaf molding on the walls. Victoria stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, her breath fogging the glass as she watched the tiny, ant-like figures on the San Francisco streets below. To them, she was a titan. To the ledger sitting on her desk, she was a ghost haunting a graveyard of bad debt. Hastings Global hadn't just hit a wall, it had disintegrated against one. The numbers on her monitor glowed like radioactive embers. A cumulative debt of $420 million, with a debt-to-equity ratio that made her CFO physically ill. For 3 generations, the Hastings name had been synonymous with architectural dominance, but the expansion into high-risk sustainable tech had turned their coffers into a sieve. They were hemorrhaging cash, losing $12 million every single week to maintain operations that were no longer yielding a profit. She turned away from the view, her heels clicking sharply against the marble, a sound that usually projected power but now felt like a countdown. On her desk lay the final notice from the consortium of banks that held the building's deed. They weren't interested in her vision or her father's legacy anymore. By the opening bell tomorrow, the hostile takeover bid from Blackwood Holdings would become official. They wouldn't just buy the company, they would strip it. The Hastings name would be removed from the skyline. The patents for her father's revolutionary alloy designs would be auctioned off to the highest bidder, and 5,000 employees, some of whom had worked for her family since she was in diapers, would be out on the street with nothing but a week's severance. The glass ceiling her father had broken to build this empire was now a rain of shards falling on her head. Victoria felt the phantom weight of her father's heavy signet ring, which she wore on a chain beneath her silk blouse. He had built this from a single concrete plant, She had turned it into a glass and steel miracle, and now she was the one presiding over its funeral. She had spent 8 months begging for a savior. She had sat in sterile waiting rooms and endured the condescending smirks of venture capitalists who saw a desperate woman instead of a CEO. Marcus Wellington had been her last prayer, a man with enough liquid capital to wipe their debt in a single stroke and the reputation to keep the sharks at bay. The irony tasted like copper in her mouth. She had spent her life curating a world where only the right people were allowed through the door. Now, the only person with the power to stop the dismantling of her life's work was the man she had just treated like a stain on her lobby floor. The empire was crumbling, and the dust was starting to choke her. Marcus Wellington watched the Manhattan skyline blur into a streak of gray and silver from the back of a nondescript sedan. He didn't own a Maybach or a Rolls-Royce. He preferred the anonymity of a standard hybrid, much like the plain white t-shirt he wore beneath a thrifted denim jacket. To the world of high finance, he was a myth, the ghost of Wall Street, a man who controlled more liquid capital than most mid-sized European nations, but refused to be photographed for Forbes. His journey hadn't begun in the gilded hallways of Pacific Heights, but in a cramped apartment in South Chicago, where the rhythmic hum of the L train was the soundtrack to his late-night coding sessions. A math prodigy who had mastered algorithmic trading by 16, Marcus had been recruited by the heavyweights of the financial world before he was old enough to buy a beer. He had worn the $5,000 suits. He had sat in the mahogany boardrooms where men discussed human capital as if it were a line item on a grocery list. But he had seen the rot behind the polish. He watched brilliant founders from underrepresented zip codes get laughed out of rooms by men whose only merit was a legacy last name. He had felt the way the air in a room changed when he entered, the subtle tightening of security guards' postures, the way secretaries assumed he was there to fix the copier until he opened his mouth and spoke in the language of billions. When Marcus struck out on his own to form Wellington Alpha, he vowed to move differently. He divested from the theater of corporate vanity. He made it his unofficial policy to arrive at high-stakes meetings, dressed as the man the world usually ignored. It was a litmus test, a diagnostic tool more accurate than any balance sheet. If a CEO couldn't see the value of a human being without the costume of wealth, they were too blinded by the past to navigate the future. He didn't want to invest in companies. He wanted to invest in leaders with the humility to recognize a partner, regardless of the wrapping. As the car pulled toward the private hangar, Marcus looked at his phone. The notification from Victoria Hastings' office was still glowing, an urgent, panicked series of messages. He remembered the look in her eyes back in the lobby, the pure, unadulterated coldness of a woman who thought she was the only one in the room who mattered. She hadn't seen an investor. She had seen a vagrant. He leaned his head back against the seat and closed his eyes. He had saved dozens of companies from the brink, but he had never saved someone from their own soul. Victoria Hastings wanted his money to save her building, but Marcus was more interested in whether there was anything left in her worth saving at all. The deal wasn't just dead, it was a lesson, and the first lesson was that the ghost didn't haunt those who didn't believe in him. The atmosphere in Victoria's private office was no longer icy. It was stagnant, thick with the metallic tang of a coming storm. She paced the length of the Persian rug, her phone clutched so tightly, her knuckles were as white as the shirt of the man she had insulted. "Where is he, Jenny?" she snapped as her assistant hovered by the door. "The 9 a.m. is 40 minutes late. Wellington is a billionaire. He didn't get that way by being tardy." Before Jenny could answer, the heavy oak doors swung open. Greg, the head of security, a man who had survived 3 decades of high-stakes corporate espionage without breaking a sweat, walked in. He wasn't looking at Victoria. He was looking at a tablet in his hand, his face the color of dry ash. "Victoria," Greg said, his voice dropping an octave, "we have a problem. Unless that problem is Marcus Wellington's car being stuck in a sinkhole, I don't want to hear it," she retorted, stopping her pacing to glare at him. "I just had a vagrant escorted out of the lobby who nearly caused a scene in front of the board. My nerves are frayed enough." Greg didn't flinch. He walked to the center of the room and tapped the tablet, mirroring the screen to the massive 80-inch monitor on the wall. "I ran the facial recognition from the lobby incident, just to ensure the solicitor didn't have a record before we filed the trespassing report." The screen flickered to life. It was a high-definition freeze frame from the lobby's security feed. There was Victoria, her face twisted in a sneer of aristocratic disgust. And there was the man in the white t-shirt, his hand extended in a gesture of peace that now looked like a death sentence. "And?" Victoria prompted, her heart beginning a slow, heavy thud against her ribs. Greg swiped the screen. A digital dossier appeared next to the grainy security footage. A rare, candid photo from a technology summit in Zurich 3 years ago popped up. It featured the same man, wearing the same calm, unreadable expression, standing between the Prime Minister of Singapore and the CEO of the world's largest sovereign wealth fund. Below the photo, the text was bold and unforgiving. Marcus Wellington, founder, Wellington Alpha, primary shareholder, Hastings Global Debt Acquisition Group. The silence that followed was absolute. The air seemed to vanish from the room. Victoria stared at the monitor, her mind frantically trying to reconcile the vagrant with the titan. The kind she had refused to touch was the only person on the planet who held the keys to her kingdom. He didn't leave a card, Greg whispered, but he told the gate security to give you a message on his way out. He said he came to see if the building was worth saving, but found the foundation was already rotten. Victoria's phone chimed in her hand. It was an automated alert from the SEC. Wellington Alpha had just filed a notice of intent to withdraw their bridge loan offer. The room felt like it was tilting. The glass ceiling hadn't just cracked, the entire sky was falling. The digital world didn't wait for Victoria to process her regret. By the time she reached for her desk to steady her trembling hands, the incident had already metastasized across the internet. It began with a single upload from a junior analyst who had been standing near the elevators. A 20-second clip captioned, "The Queen of Hastings Global shows her true colors." By 2 p.m., the video had 10 million views. By 3 p.m., it was the top trending topic on every major social platform. The footage was devastatingly clear. Victoria's sneer was rendered in high definition, her voice cutting through the lobby's acoustics as she told a man of Marcus's stature that she didn't shake hands with his kind. It wasn't just a corporate blunder. It was a cultural explosion. In an era where reputation was the only currency that mattered, Victoria had just declared moral bankruptcy. The reaction from the market was instantaneous and violent. On the trading floor, the Hastings ticker symbol began to glow a frantic, pulsing red. In after-hours trading, where the big institutional players moved like sharks in the dark, the stock price didn't just dip, it plummeted. It dropped 15% in 20 minutes, then 25, then 30. Analysts on cable news networks were already using the word unrecoverable. They played the clip on a loop, dissecting the body language of the board members who had stood by and watched, their silence captured as complicity. Victoria sat in the dark of her office, the only light coming from the 3 monitors displaying the carnage. Every time she refreshed the page, another few $100 million of market cap vanished into the ether. Major retail partners began issuing public statements, distancing themselves from the values displayed by Hastings' global leadership. The company's Slack channels were a wildfire of employee outrage and resignation threats. The phones in the lobby were ringing off the hooks with death threats and press inquiries, but Victoria heard none of it. She only heard the echo of her own voice. "I don't shake hands with your kind." She had spent a lifetime building a fortress of elitism, and now, those very walls were being hammered down by a 20-second video. The hostile takeover wasn't just a threat anymore, it was a mercy killing. Her company was no longer a business, it was a pariah. By the time the sun set over the Pacific, Victoria Hastings was the most hated woman in America, and her father's legacy was worth less than the paper it was printed on. The hum of the G650's engines was a low, mournful drone that vibrated through the soles of Victoria's designer heels. Outside the small oval window, the world was an abyss of midnight blue, stretching somewhere between the wreckage of San Francisco and the uncertainty of the Midwest. She had tracked Marcus's flight plan through a contact at the FAA. He was heading to Chicago, back to the neighborhood that had forged him. She was chasing a man who had every reason to keep running. In the cabin, the air-conditioned silence was stifling. Victoria sat with a legal pad on her lap, the page mocking her with its emptiness. For 3 hours she had tried to draft an apology, but the pen felt like a foreign object in her hand. She realized, with a sickening jolt of clarity, that she didn't actually know how to say she was sorry. Her entire life had been a series of corrections, not confessions. When a deal went south, she blamed the market. When a product failed, she fired the lead engineer. Even as a child, her mistakes were polished away by her father's lawyers or her mother's social standing. She had been raised to believe that power was the ability to never have to admit you were wrong. Now she was stripped of that armor. She replayed the video in her head, not the viral version the world saw, but the raw memory of Marcus's eyes. He hadn't looked angry. He had looked disappointed, as if he were observing a crumbling monument of a bygone era. The phrase "your kind" tasted like ash in her mouth now. She had used it as a shield to keep the world at a distance, a way to categorize people so she didn't have to see them. The realization hit her with the force of turbulence. She wasn't just flying across the country to save a balance sheet. She was flying toward a mirror. She had spent 34 years being told she was the pinnacle of achievement, yet she was currently a fugitive from her own reputation, fleeing a burning empire she had ignited with a single sentence. As the jet began its descent toward Midway, the lights of the city flickering below like scattered diamonds, Victoria felt a wave of nausea. She wasn't afraid of the financial ruin anymore. She was terrified of the silence that would follow when she finally stood before Marcus Wellington. For the first time in her life, she wasn't the architect of the situation. She was just a woman in a crimson suit, alone in the sky, realizing that the most expensive flight of her life was the one she was taking to beg for a soul she had forgotten she owned. The Uber dropped Victoria off in front of a weathered brick building in South Chicago, a stark departure from the steel spires of Hastings Plaza. The morning air was sharp, smelling of wet pavement and diesel. Above the double doors, a faded banner read, Wellington Community Youth Center. There was no red carpet, no valet, and no glass-enclosed reception desk. Instead, there was a line, a long, slow-moving queue of people that snaked down the sidewalk. Victoria smoothed her suit jacket, a reflex of a dying habit, and attempted to stride past the crowd toward the entrance. A woman in a thick parka stepped into her path, her expression unmoved by the designer label on Victoria's shoulder. "Back of the line, honey," the woman said, pointing a gloved finger toward the end of the block. "I'm here to see Marcus Wellington," Victoria said, her voice pitched in the tone that usually commanded immediate compliance. "It's a matter of national corporate urgency." The woman didn't budge. "We're all here to see Marcus. My son needs a mentor, that man over there needs a business grant, and the lady behind him needs a roof. You're just another person with a problem. Get in line." Victoria felt the heat rise to her face. For the first time in her adult life, her name carried no weight. Here, Hastings, was just a word, not a key. She retreated to the end of the line, standing behind a young man in a worn hoodie. The minutes bled into an hour. The wind whipped her hair into a tangled mess, and her thin heels began to ache against the cracked concrete. To the people around her, she wasn't a CEO. She was a curiosity. A woman in a $6,000 suit who looked entirely out of place in a world that required practical shoes and patience. As she shuffled forward inch by inch, she watched Marcus through the center's windows. He wasn't sitting behind a mahogany desk. He was at a plastic folding table, leaning in close to listen to an elderly man, his hands animated and his posture open. He looked exactly as he had in her lobby, casual, present, and powerful, but the context had shifted. In her world, he was the angel she needed to buy her way out of a crisis. In this world, he was a pillar. By the time she reached the heavy wooden doors, her legs were shaking from more than just the cold. The gatekeeper at the front desk, a teenage girl with a clipboard, didn't even look up as Victoria approached. "Name?" the girl asked. "Victoria Hastings." The girl's pen paused. She looked up, her eyes scanning Victoria's disheveled appearance with a flicker of recognition from the viral video. A heavy silence settled between them. The girl didn't call for security. She simply pointed to a row of plastic chairs against a wall covered in children's drawings. "Take a seat, Miss Hastings. He'll get to you when he's finished with the people who were here before the sun came up." Victoria sat. The chair was hard, the room was loud, and for the first time, she wasn't the most important person in the room. She was just a woman waiting for a chance she didn't deserve. The gymnasium smelled of floor wax and old basketball leather, a cavernous space where the echoes of neighborhood dreams felt louder than the roar of the stock market. Marcus sat alone on the bottom bleacher, his elbows resting on his knees, still wearing the same white t-shirt that had served as Victoria's excuse to ruin her life. There were no cameras here, no board members to perform for, and no glass walls to shield her. The silence was a physical weight. "You've had a long walk, Victoria," Marcus said, his voice quiet but resonant. He didn't stand up. He didn't offer a hand. Victoria stopped 10 feet away, her crimson suit now wrinkled and stained by the Chicago rain. The apology she had rehearsed on the plane dissolved like salt in water. "I came to fix this," she managed, her voice brittle. "The board is ready to sign whatever terms you want. The funding, the bridge loan, it's the only way to save the 5,000 people who work for me." Marcus looked up, his gaze steady and clinical. "Don't use those families as a human shield for your ego. You didn't fly across the country for them. You flew here because for the first time in your life you're the one being looked down upon, and you can't stand the view from the bottom." "I made a mistake," she snapped, the old fire of her arrogance flickering. "I misjudged your position because of your attire. In my world, business is conducted with a certain level of decorum." "Decorum?" Marcus laughed, a short, humorless sound. "Let's be honest, Victoria. If I were a white man in this t-shirt, you would have assumed I was a tech genius from Palo Alto. You would have offered me a chair and a coffee. You didn't reject my attire. You rejected my humanity because it didn't fit the portrait of power your father hung on your wall. You called it business sense in the lobby. But in the light of day, we both know its real name." He stood up then, his height casting a long shadow across the hardwood. You think you're here to negotiate a contract. But I don't invest in companies led by people who are blind to the world around them. That's not a business risk. It's a character defect. You told me you don't shake hands with my kind. Tell me, Victoria, now that your empire is ash and your name is a punchline, what kind do you think you belong to now? Victoria opened her mouth to argue, to cite her MBA, her accolades, her heritage, but the words died in her throat. Looking at Marcus in the emptiness of the gym, she realized he wasn't the one who had failed the test. She was the one who was truly impoverished. The silence stretched until it broke her. For the first time, she didn't look for a way out. She just looked at the floor, the weight of her own bigotry finally too heavy to carry. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out a single sheet of paper, folded twice. It wasn't the thick, leather-bound prospectus Victoria was used to. It was a plain document that felt more like a sentencing than a deal. He didn't hand it to her. He placed it on the bleacher between them. "I'll save the 5,000 jobs," he said, his voice dropping to a low, ironclad register. "But I won't save you. Not the version of you that walked into that lobby." Victoria reached for the paper with trembling fingers. The terms were staggering. The investment would come in the form of a $1.2 billion injection, but it carried a morality and governance clause that was effectively a corporate guillotine. Victoria would be stripped of all voting rights. She would remain the face of the company for the duration of the transition, but she would be a CEO in name only, answering to a board she no longer controlled. "There's more," Marcus said, watching her eyes scan the text. "The apology won't be a press release drafted by your crisis management team. There will be no teleprompters, no lighting kits, and no curated hashtags. You will go back to that plaza, and you will speak to your employees and the public from the heart, or what's left of it. If I hear a single syllable of PR speak, the funds freeze instantly." Victoria felt the air leave her lungs. To her, the company was her identity, her bloodline. To lose control was to lose herself. "You're asking me to commit professional suicide," she whispered. "I'm asking you to pay the tax on your arrogance," Marcus countered. "You've spent years at the top looking down. The contract requires you to spend the next year at the bottom. You will visit every branch, every warehouse, and every service center. You will listen to the people you didn't think were worth a handshake. You will learn their names. You will see the faces behind the human capital you nearly liquidated." The document was a roadmap for her own dismantling. It required her to surrender her $5 million annual bonus to a diversity scholarship fund, and to undergo a year-long sabbatical in a junior-level role within the firm once the new leadership was installed. It was designed to strip away the crimson suit, the Chanel armor, and the Pacific Heights pedigree, until only the human being remained. Victoria looked at the pen Marcus held out. The gymnasium was silent, save for the distant sound of a basketball hitting a rim in the courtyard. She realized this wasn't an investment in Hastings Global. It was a hostile takeover of her soul. She took the pen. The signature didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a surrender. As the ink dried, the angel stood up and walked toward the exit, leaving Victoria alone on the cold bleachers with the heavy, humbling weight of a second chance she had to earn one day at a time. The morning sun filtered through the modest windows of the Hastings Regional Service Center in East Oakland, a world away from the sterile, soaring glass of the 50th floor executive suite. Victoria arrived 10 minutes early, carrying her own coffee in a reusable mug. She wasn't wearing a crimson Chanel suit or heels that clicked like a countdown. Today, she wore a simple navy polo with the company logo embroidered over her heart and a pair of sensible, broken-in trousers. The weight she carried now wasn't the burden of a crumbling empire, but the quiet, steady responsibility of a woman who had finally learned the value of the ground she stood on. The lobby was bustling with the energy of a Tuesday shift change. Victoria moved through the space with a transparency she once would have found terrifying. A year ago, she would have been a ghost in this room, a name on a letterhead that people feared. Now she was just Victoria, the senior associate who knew the names of the night shift security guards and the specific mechanical quirks of the fourth-floor printers. She had spent the last 12 months in the morality clause trenches, moving from warehouse floors to customer service cubicles, listening to the stories of the 5,000 people she had almost rendered invisible. A young man stood by the reception desk, looking nervous in a stiff, brand-new dress shirt. He was a new trainee, likely fresh out of a local community college, clutching a folder of orientation papers. He looked up as Victoria approached, his eyes darting to her name tag, and then back to her face with a flicker of recognition, not from the viral video that had long since faded from the headlines, but from the person she had become. "Excuse me," he stammered. "I'm looking for the orientation lead. I'm Andre, the new IT junior." Victoria didn't look at his clothes. She didn't scan for pedigree or judge the cheap fabric of his shirt. She looked directly into his eyes and saw the spark of a beginning. Without a second's hesitation, she reached out. It wasn't a calculated move for a camera or a scripted PR moment. It was an instinct, a bridge built of flesh and bone. "Welcome to the team, Andre," she said, her voice warm and grounded. "I'm Victoria. I'll be showing you the ropes today." She grasped his hand in a firm, sincere shake, a contact that felt nothing like a contamination and everything like a connection. As they walked toward the training room, she didn't look back at the skyline. The ghost of Wall Street had given her a second chance not to reclaim her throne, but to find her humanity. For the first time in her life, Victoria Hastings wasn't looking down from the top. She was exactly where she needed to be, right here on the ground level.